Dobro jutro. And I must admit, that's the only Slovenian I'll be able to give you today. But thank you for what I hope was a very nice introduction. I won't know anyways. And thank you to our hosts for inviting me to speak and to be here and having me join you in your lovely city and your lovely country for this very important conference. So for the next 50 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about a range of different pieces of research that I have led across Europe and specifically in the UK over the last few years, as is relevant to online child sexual abuse. However, in discussing some of the information and some of the evidence, I will draw into other areas of research that my team undertakes to show some of the parallels and to really focus on what I think is an important message that everyone should take away, in that we need to work at dealing with these problems in partnership across organizations. And I know that there are a lot of different representatives from different organizations here today, but also that there's a lot of good practice and good learning from other areas in criminal justice, especially as is linked to the online world and cyberspace, that we can borrow from, utilize, and help in supporting us in tackling online child sexual exploitation. So just as a bit of a background, I am a forensic psychologist, and I work as a director at a think tank in the UK called the National Centre for Social Research, where I lead a series of large research projects, mostly with government, some with international governments, such as the UN. We work with Europol and Interpol, but I also work as a senior fellow at the Centre for Abuse and Trauma Studies. And at the Centre for Abuse and Trauma Studies, we do a lot of cross-disciplinary research. So as I say, I'm a psychologist, but we work with a lot of political scientists, social workers, policymakers within government, psychotherapists, lawyers, and a few other individuals. And what we try and do with a lot of our research is get away from this idea that the online world, cyberspace, is different than when we're interacting and behaving in the real world. What we try to do is to make sure that practitioners, that the professionals and the experts that we're working with are looking at young, vulnerable people, looking at parents, looking at teachers, looking at police officers, looking at all these experts, and understanding some of the challenges they face with the increased use and engagement with technology, but not looking at it as just a technological issue, looking at it as part of our current regular digital lives. So understanding that technology is not going anywhere, the internet's not going anywhere, and that we really need to normalize some of these behaviors, some of these actions, some of these activities. And if we can get to that point in understanding that it's not going anywhere, it'll be very useful in helping do risk assessments, tailor treatments and interventions for the individuals that may require them. So I start by sharing this overarching slide with you, which is a piece of work that my colleagues and I are doing for the British Home Office at the moment. And essentially, it's showing 3 different sets of research that we've been undertaking for a few years. We're looking at online child sexual abuse, we're looking at online financial crimes, and we're also looking at online radicalization and being drawn into terrorism. But this research project right now in particular is trying to look at how these processes, how victims are identified, how victims are victimized, how offenders and perpetrators operate, all follow a relatively similar process. Although the outcomes are significantly different in terms of criminal justice outcomes, the process, the vulnerabilities, the risk, but also the protective factors and the resilience that we may need to focus on can be quite similar. So each of these strands were very distinct and different pieces of research that we did. However, the current piece is looking at what we're calling wider online harms, exploring how actually, when you look across risk and protection in these areas, there's a lot of good practice and a lot of good sharing we can do in being better at providing the support and the responses that we need to for victims, for families, and for those social institutions that may be involved in trying to combat, to police, and to intervene in these issues. Now, obviously, I'm going to focus on online child sexual exploitation today and sexual abuse, but I just want to kind of leave that little piece with all of you. And if anybody wants to talk a bit more about some of the other research, I'm very happy to afterwards. But we are going to be publishing this in the foreseeable future, and it's really quite powerful to see some of our results right now in looking at how, for example, the counterterrorism police officers are doing things that actually those police officers that are working in child exploitation could be learning from and doing as well. What's also really interesting is seeing what social workers are saying, for example, dealing with young boys who may be being neglected or who may be in residential schools, who are being abused, and then being drawn into terrorism and extremist organizations, but looking at their constellation of vulnerabilities and how they're dealing with them and what they're doing in terms of making them more resilient could be borrowed and used into online child sexual abuse and exploitation. So just consider that as we go forward. This will be my last slide and discussion around anything outside of the world of online CSA, but it is really powerful to look across and to kind of open up our thinking a little bit around who and what and where we can learn from others. So about 2 years ago, we embarked on an exploration of policing practices and community responses to online child sexual abuse and exploitation across Europe. Now, it wasn't every European country, but we led the project from the UK. I was the leader. And we engaged with, again, lots of the different professional bodies that I've already named. We talked to young people, and we spent a lot of time with police across Europe. And we tried to come up with some of the key difficulties that we felt this kind of joint-up response we're dealing with. What was making it even more challenging to deal and to provide the response that we needed to for this growing threat. In the first lecture, or the first presentations this morning, we already talked and we saw some statistics about the actual large number of young people that are being exploited and abused online. So I'm not going to share additional statistics on that with you. We know that it's growing. We know that it partially may be growing as a consequence of improved technologies, anonymous browsing, but we also know and hope that part of the reason we're seeing an increase is that because there's improved and better reporting, because people are understanding the law a little bit better. And I'll touch upon that when I get into some of our findings with police officers. But over the course of the 2 years, and talking again with police in Europol and across Europe, we came up with these 5 key themes, which we found being the kind of critical challenges that were facing the appropriate responders in protecting young people and ensuring that they weren't vulnerable to victimization. Now, some of these are going to be extremely simple for you. You all have heard of them in a different way or another, but a few of them I'm hoping will assist you with your own thinking and your own practice in this world. The first is what we discuss as home proliferation. Now, you all know exactly what that means. If I asked everybody in the room who has an internet connection in their house, raise your hand. I know you all have to raise your hand right now, right? It's a simple point, but it's a powerful point. Now, we know, for example, historically, child sexual abuse was predominantly what we would label in the UK as intrafamilial. Not every case, but a large proportion were done by people in the household or connected family and friends. However, what's happening now with our connections into the internet and into our bedrooms into our living rooms, no longer using desktop computers. Because when it was desktop computers, it was easy to prevent. You just made sure you put it in a place in the house where mom and dad would see you on the internet. But now, the internet is in your bedroom with your mobile phone. So it provides, essentially, from a criminological perspective, an added opportunity for offenders and perpetrators to reach vulnerable individuals. Also, parents can't necessarily always be watching their child whilst they're engaged in their bedrooms, while they're doing homework, while they're doing other activities, because so much of their life is spent online. So this is one of the key first challenges that we saw coming from police officers, social workers, probation officers, the idea that they can't necessarily see everything happening in the home. The second challenge, again, is one you'll all be familiar with. It's the concept of globalization. And from a joint-up policing and legislative response, it's difficult to police this area and to deal with this area when you have different jurisdictions, with different laws, with different perpetrators, talking to people and victims in different countries, of different ages, and the element of this uncertainty around time zones, the unnecessary kind of care of what time of the day it is. Essentially, a victim can be victimized 24 hours a day, a perpetrator can perpetrate 24 hours a day, and police and governmental responses may not necessarily always be able to be there to identify and to watch. Evolution is an important one, and many of you, I'm sure, in the room will have children. I, at this current point in time, have a 22-year-old sister that lives in my home with me. I call her my 22-year-old daughter because I take care of her. And it's interesting because we're of 12 years difference in age. And I learned so much from her about the technology she and her friends use that actually, in my professional capacity, when I'm working with police, when I'm working with social workers, I may not necessarily know. Technology changes so quickly. There's so many different applications. There's so many different little facets and tools that people can use that it makes it really, really difficult. And I have this one analogy that I'll never forget. I traveled home for Christmas one year. My sister was still in high school with all of her friends, and they were all sitting around the kitchen table, and they all had their mobile phones in front of them, and they were all laughing, and they were all talking about this and that. And what they were doing was they were essentially trading photographs. The girls were trading photographs of all the boys in their classes' penises. They were sitting there and collecting them like somebody would collect coins or stamps or cards. Now, my sister, again, being very naive and younger, and she was much younger then, wasn't quite aware of what I did for a living. And I sat there and explained to them that they were all committing offenses. And they went, no, but we're not. I just haven't seen what his looks like yet, and I'll trade you the other ones for this one. You need the full collection. And it's like, what are you even doing this on? So again, this idea of we can't always keep up with what they're doing. That links very nice into my next point, which again is another common concept within kind of cyber psychology and understanding, but I look at it in a slightly different way. We talk about the digital divide. We talk about how the current generation of younger millennials are digital natives. They've grown up with technology. They're coherent with technology. They're well-spoken with their technology, whereas us older-ish folk aren't as good, and it takes us longer to learn, just like with a language, hence why my Slovenian is very bad. But I don't mean it in terms of young people and their parents now. I mean it in terms of our responses. When you think about who is making those critical decisions in terms of legislation, in terms of policy, in terms of investigative practice, it's the same concept. Our very senior experts across Europe our very senior police, our very senior policymakers and government officials who are writing the policy and making decisions on this suffer from the same consequences of that exact thing, that divide, when we know that the victims' profiles are changing, when we know that offender profiles are changing. So it's interesting to think that those making the decisions, although very experienced and very able and very knowledgeable with what they're talking about, do not necessarily have that same real-time understanding and engagement with the technology. And last is my favorite point, which I think is very important as well. This is kind of one of the key difficulties that all of us face, and why victims will always be very vulnerable to online child sexual exploitation. And we talk about something called a temporal incongruence. And all I mean by that is that we have three very different time frames kind of incongruently operating against each other. The three time frames are policy, development, human development, and technology development. Policy and law can take, any sitting government 4 or 5 years to pass, depending on how significant it is. Still good, still important, but it takes time. Human development, obviously, you're born, you're a child, you go through puberty, and then you're an adult. So that age of vulnerability, if you will, lasts in terms of online child sexual exploitation under the UNCRC, approximately 18 years. But across those 18 years, you'll have different levels of resilience, of protection, and of vulnerability, which then again can come into conflict with the policy development if it's being focused specifically on an age group. And last, as I've already mentioned, is the technology development. Technology changes extremely, extremely quickly. There have been multiple times where I've been working with the Metropolitan Police in London, where we will go out of the office on a Friday, where we've identified X, Y, and Z offender, or a new app, or a new website, or a new browser that perpetrators or victims may be using, and then we come back on Monday and they're all gone, or they've changed to where they're talking, or the codes they're using. We also know that the apps that a lot of the young people are using change dramatically. I remember giving a briefing one morning to some of the senior police officers about Kik. Everybody heard of Kik? K-I-K, which again is an anonymous messaging network which is prolific with online perpetrators and offenders of child sexual abuse. You can go and download Kik and genuinely almost find anything you want on there. Yet lots of the police that I was working with at the time had never heard of it and had no idea what it was. And the only reason I knew about it is, again, because of that very important source of information I have, my sister. So again, lots of this won't be new to you, but I do think it's important to think about some of these themes even as we move forward, because these themes are never going to change. I do a lot of work in kind of Central and Eastern Africa, and a lot of those police officers and those social workers are dealing with the advance of internet penetration into more rural areas, and they don't even know where to begin with the basics of online protection. So again, as technology changes, as the speed changes, we do need to kind of keep these things in perspective. Now, this slide just kind of, again, focuses a bit on what I was just saying, but takes it more to the importance of the joint-up, multi-agency, multidisciplinary response. If there's one thing I think very firmly about in terms of tackling online child sexual abuse and exploitation, is that, and I think many of you agree with this, it is not just a policing problem. All right? The most basic definition of a crime, obviously, is contravention of the criminal law. Fine, there does need to be a police response. But I know for those police in the room, or for those that have worked with police, and from police from the very beginnings of their career all the way to the very senior management that I've dealt with, they all agree that the volumes are too high and that they need help. And so towards the end of this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about our model of a public health approach in dealing with online child sexual abuse. But it is important to understand that I do, and I think many of you do think, and I know the room itself has a lot of different practitioners and professionals believe that we need to work better in partnership. It can't just be the police. One of the chief constables in England and Wales, Chief Constable Simon Bailey, holds the portfolio for online child sexual abuse. So he's responsible in changing and advocating for policing practices in the UK around this area. And he himself has on multiple occasions stated the police cannot just police themselves out of this problem. They require help, support, and joint up working partnerships. But this slide tries to demonstrate some of the difficulties with that, sadly. Because one of those key issues is because of some of the lack of standardization in practice, because of how some jurisdictions may have more money to deal with the problems in better ways, may have better local partnerships with technology industries, may have better educational approaches, may just have better awareness, you often have competing interests. So again, as I mentioned, the police's primary objective is to investigate and to arrest and to charge where possible. But often some of the platforms and applications that these offenses are occurring on or in which facilitate these offenses don't necessarily have the same articulated response. We know that things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they're not a public institution in the same way that the police are. The police are there to serve and protect the public. They need to police through the trust of the population, the confidence of the population. They need to be seen as having a legitimate response. The technology industry, though, sadly, is for the most part there to offer a service and operates under commercial aims and objectives. Their primary duty is to their customers. Now, part of that, obviously, is that these young victims are their customers as well. But again, when you don't have joint up aims and objectives in how you operate in tackling these issues, and you have to work in partnership, it can cause conflict and it can cause challenges in communication and transparency. There's also the issue of uneven resource allocation. I've spoken to many of you before, and again will share another real anecdote with you. I work with a forensic analyst at Scotland Yard. He's responsible for going into any scene that in London that has been identified as an online child exploitation or abuse case. He brings his forensic analyst and crime analyst team with him, and he often draws a picture which illustrates his difficulties. They're not getting any more money than they were back in the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s in dealing with this. But they're still walking into the same crime scenes. He still has the same number of staff, and he's still walking out with the same number of evidence boxes that are full to the top. But instead of just pictures and video cassettes and books now, he's walking out with little USBs which have thousands and thousands and thousands of videos and photographs on them. And yes, there are technological solutions to deal with some of that. However, from the investigative process, and in order for him to lay a charge and for that to then be given on to the Crown Prosecution Service to go through the judiciary, they still need to have human beings engaging with that evidence and that content. Whereas the technology industry has, as we know, a lot more money. I have no stocks in Facebook. I really wish I would have a very long time ago. But again, you can see that with those different priorities, aims, and objectives, the money does become an issue. Again, we've talked about working partnerships and that's important, but then there's the issue of prioritization of intervention and prevention. Again, different bodies are going to want to do it in different ways. Different organizations are going to have different views on what should be prioritized and what shouldn't be prioritized. However, if we do look at this from a multidisciplinary perspective, we will need to articulate a joint up priority of what we need to do. And one of the emerging themes that comes out with the work we do is education and awareness. Kind of like how probably 10, 20, 30 years ago, there was more of a focus on making people wear seatbelts in cars. There was more of a focus on getting people to stop drinking and driving. There was more of a focus on the health consequences of smoking. All of these things took time to start and see change, but it was informing and educating the population at whole in order for them to be able to make educated decisions, in order for them to gather information and to go through that decision-making process independently so that they could then start to standardize things in their own homes. We could then start to standardize it in schools, and I'll come back to all of that towards the end of my presentation. But again, important to think about where we should be prioritizing our response. And that includes thinking about where we should be focusing the finances and the resources. So don't get scared by this slide, because I will explain it to you. It's a very important slide. So when I was asked to put this presentation together, it was to ensure that I was able to speak across your disciplines and across your organizations. This is part of the work that we did with European police forces. And what we were very interested in learning from police was exactly what kind of training they received in terms of dealing specifically with online child sexual abuse, how prepared they felt in dealing with any case of online child sexual abuse they may be faced with, and whether that training and preparedness allowed them to feel that they were able to investigate that case of online child sexual abuse to an appropriate and diligent manner. So we talked to police officers across 5 European countries of all different ranks. We talked from the very, very junior police that are still walking on the street, all the way up to the most senior members of the management of the 43 police forces in England and Wales, for example, of the head of the special units in the Netherlands, of the Garde. So we made sure that we talked about all police officers about what and how they felt they were ready. What you see then on this slide is this cluster of yeses. Over on the far right-hand side there is police officers telling me, yes, they've received training, yes, the training was very good, yes, that training led to them feeling prepared, and yes, they think that they dealt with investigations in an appropriate way. Easy, good, very, very powerful, if not simple. I'll come back to it in a minute. Over here, though, I have a whole bunch of no, 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 no's. And those no's say, no, I didn't receive specific training. No, I didn't feel prepared. No, I'm not aware of the national legislation around online child sexual abuse. No, I'm not aware of the European directives in online child sexual abuse. No, I don't think any case I've dealt with I was able to deal with appropriately. Those people saying no as well are also saying no, they don't actually ask the victims further information about their online behavior when engaged in an investigation. And no, they don't seize or take any additional technology away from suspects when they arrest them and bring them in for further investigation. So, okay, fine. I've got a group of yes, 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 and a group of no, 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 no. The key difference between these two groups of people is quite simple. All of my yeses are much more senior, older police officers that are near to the end of their careers. So these are your senior management who have been around, who have extremely powerful and good experience, who are excellent investigators, but they don't really do the investigations anymore. Whereas my no's are a lot of my very young officers. There are a lot of my officers who are the ones that are picking up the telephone when a mother or father calls and says, oh my gosh, I've just looked at my daughter's mobile phone, something's going on. So what this slide is telling me across the European countries that we dealt with was very much that we do have some extremely skilled individuals, but those extremely skilled individuals are in management positions and are not necessarily involved in day-to-day operational policing anymore. It's also telling me that there is a huge training gap for my younger officers who are coming out and are the ones who are most likely to respond. What's extremely important and actually quite critical with that younger group is the simple fact that if they don't feel skilled and they don't feel trained appropriately and they don't ask victims the right questions or ask to take perpetrators' technology, it's very likely that they could be missing critical evidence and cases of online child sexual abuse. And that's not criticizing the senior officers or the junior officers. It's saying, quite importantly, that we need to make sure, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, we provide more focus on making sure that even if it's basic training, even if it's part of their induction, and when they start their operational policing careers, that there's a bit of awareness and a kind of focus on some of the law. Because online child sexual abuse or real-world child sexual abuse is still child sexual abuse. Which brings me to my second slide. Again, don't be afraid. I will explain it very simply. We see a lot of yeses and a lot of no's. Again, just for transparency, the yeses are, again, my very senior expert police officers, and the no's are my much more junior, inexperienced officers. And all this slide is trying to articulate to you is what we think or what they think needs to be done moving forward in terms of improving skills, in terms of improving the investigative process, and in terms of ensuring that we are providing the best provision of service to the victims and their families. So those that are saying yes, these again are the ones that feel competent. Some of the reasons why they feel that they can kind of, quite confidently approach their cases are because they have experienced things like secondments or apprenticeships or placements in other organizations. Some of the placements that they shared with us were spending time with the Internet Watch Foundation, which you've all heard of, I'm sure, before. Some of them were spending time with other third sector organizations, and some of them were spending time with Facebook and Twitter and their teams in making sure they understood some of the things that were going on and how young people were engaged online. They also had brought in academic expert groups. So one of the things we have in the UK is something called the UK Centre for Child Internet Safety, UKIS. And on the UKIS board, we have academics. I sit on the UKIS Evidence Group board. We have technology representatives, NGOs in third sector, and police officers. And again, we share information together to then go and put back into police forces and communities. The no's, quite simply in this situation, again say that those young people haven't experienced that, but again, they would see a desire and a utility to it. Another very interesting suggestion moving forward by the police were to also have these other organizations come and do a placement with them, come and sit with them for one day a week, come and learn about their processes, their difficulties, their challenges, all of this to hopefully assist a bit with their own understanding of each other's aims and objectives to provide a more appropriate joint-up partnership. So that's a bit about the policing side of things, and now I'm going to go into some of the victim work we did, which again would inform how police and other third sector and institutional responses should be directed. Some of you may be familiar with this work by colleagues Stephen Webster, Antonia Bifulco, that was done a few years ago. It was one of the very first qualitative pieces of research looking at offender and victim profiles of what online groomers did and what those that were being victimized looked like. And they came up with a very basic 3 categorical response. You had resilient young people that were aware and felt protected. They could get in trouble, but they knew how to go and seek help if they needed it. You had risk takers, which were much more impulsive and risky online and did silly things. They were often very susceptible to sextortion and blackmail. And then you had vulnerable young people, and these were young people that perhaps were not as socially, did not have confidence and self-esteem in the same way as other young people, and sought friendships, love, and intimacy online, and as a consequence would often be susceptible to the tactics of groomers. However, this was done a long time ago, and we thought as part of our work we would work on solidifying this and making it slightly more accurate. So we surveyed about 1,500 students across the countries. I'm just showing you some of the UK findings right now to see what kind of risks we could consider in understanding these profiles. Now, the most positive thing to take away from this slide first is that the majority of young people that we spoke to and surveyed said that they hadn't done any of these things. Now, we suspect many of them were being dishonest, but even without that, it's still powerful to know that we're already starting with a larger group who are at least stating they're okay. But what is important is that you do see those little, where I have my red circles, another second large group who are stating that at least one time these things have happened to them. They've been asked for sexual information, to act sexually, to send photographs or videos, or to meet in person. None of this, I imagine, is overly surprising. Here again, we asked them about who the people were they were meeting with. A lot of them were people their own age. You can see that the vast majority of the people that were asking for the information were men. And the 24% that I have circled for you towards the bottom there is very important, and it's very important for one reason. It's because that's showing me, essentially, that these are adults that are making these requests to children. When it's younger and around the same age, there's some questions around the appropriateness of it. Of course, it's still illegal, but I'm focusing on adult solicitation right now because the whole area of peer-on-peer online sexual exploitation is a whole other area that we're still doing quite a bit of research on. So we did a whole bunch of statistics, and again, I'm going to explain this, so don't worry. I do have a publication that goes along with this that I would urge for those that are interested to read, but we came up with 4 profiles of adolescents and children in Europe that were at risk. So firstly, it's important to understand my squares. The lowest line throughout, which is called the adapted adolescent. Now, my adapted adolescent is similar to my resilient adolescent. They are aware, they may have gotten into trouble online, they may have been asked for material, they may have sent material but were less likely to, but they knew how to seek help, and they knew that if they were in trouble, they could call the police or go to their parents. Great, it's good to know, right? And as you can see, that was my largest subsample. We then go to my triangles, my inquisitive non-sexual. Now, these individuals were also at low risk. They did do slightly more inappropriate things online. So they did, behave in a risky way online, not so much offline. They would take in comments and calls about sexuality, but they would never often send the photos or meet people. And if they did, they again knew how to seek help. Okay, those 2 groups, fantastic. My 2 biggest groups. Let's get into my 2 highest risk groups. So you have my diamonds the inquisitive sexual, and my X's, which are my risk takers. So my risk takers are mostly boys, all right? It was predominantly young boys across Europe. Nearly 85% of the sample were young boys. Now, these boys did lots of risky, impulsive things in the real world, but also on the internet. They, however, told us that they were less likely to seek help and less likely to disclose if they'd been abused online because they were too ashamed and embarrassed to do so. So you can see, although they did do things more sexual online than my previous two groups, they still were not as bad as the final group I'll talk about. We do also think, though, that the young boys may be higher than it shows at the very far side of the graph in engaging in sexual online behavior and meeting strangers that they meet online in the real world, because they may not just be admitting that it happened to them. Then you have my inquisitive sexuals. Now, this group of people, contrarily to the risk takers, were predominantly young women, girls. These were young girls that didn't act as antisocially and impulsively on the general internet, but that were very likely to send photographs, videos, and to meet people for sexual encounters. They were likely to be bullied in the real world, to take drugs and alcohol. They were also very likely to be part of the LGBTQ community. And one of our arguments, our understanding of that, is that they perhaps spent more time online because of some of their real-world social difficulties in discovering and engaging with their sexualities, which meant that they were more susceptible to meeting people that they may have perceived to have a relationship with online. So again, I'm going to go through these very quickly because they're not very difficult when you look at it. So we wanted to know, and we should all want to know, okay, so we understand these things that make people more or less risky. What out of these things can tell me whether somebody is going to go and seek help? With my easy adapted adolescents, the ones that were most protected, the best predictor for them to seek help was if they received something online that was sexual that they did not want to receive, they would seek help. My inquisitive non-sexual, again, if they received something they did not want to receive, they would seek help. But also, the less risky they were in the real world, so getting into trouble, bullying, drugs and alcohol, the more likely they would be to seek help. With my boys, my risk-taking, aggressive young people, again, this is interesting. So if they receive something they did not want to receive, they would seek help. But our argument with them is the boys may not, again, disclose if they wanted or didn't want it. So we don't know how accurate that is. We think it could actually be not even be significant in this instance. But then very sadly, my most risky group of individuals, those young women, the inquisitive sexual ones, nothing was able to predict whether or not they would seek help. They are unlikely to seek help. We know that sometimes they will talk to their friends, but we also know that often their friends are also being groomed, and therefore that may play a part in normalizing their experience of victimization. So, finishing it all up, because I only have a few minutes left, what did we learn through all of that analysis? Well, in terms of online sexual solicitation, we discovered that more than half of our young people had been solicited by somebody to have a sexual experience online. More than half of those were by men, and more than half of those were by an older man. Again, as simple as that 5+ element was, it's important when thinking about our responses between online child sexual abuse and peer-to-peer sexual abuse. As for help seeking, I already mentioned, young people were most likely to request support from a friend when solicited online. I know that's a silly finding, and I know I just said to you all that that may not be useful in situations where the young people are also being abused, but it is important that we all know that, because guess what? The young people aren't telling their parents, and they're not telling the Internet Watch Foundation, and they're not necessarily calling a children's charity or reporting it. They're telling their friends. So focusing on education and awareness and promoting kind of this idea that, yeah, you put a photograph up or a video up, and now it's on Facebook, and that's bad, and that's a crime, but we're here to help you, and we're here to make sure that it all goes away in one way or another. It's sending that message. What do we see as the key vulnerabilities? Being female, bullied, exclusion from school came up a lot in terms of not liking being at school. Hence, when they go home, they spend an inordinate amount of time on the internet, and they did not learn about internet safety at home or school. I find that finding slightly funny, because I'm sure many of you in the room have seen good internet safety and bad internet safety. So I remember a few years ago looking at what was being delivered in schools in England and Wales, and it was good if the year was 1997, all right? But it wasn't 1997 a few years ago. So it's, again, making sure that it's accessible. I've seen some of the online material that you do here in Slovenia and some of the print material, and it's good. It's accessible, it's colorful, it's interactive, but it's making sure that that group can use it appropriately. What were the key risk factors? Well, people that openly shared information online, people that had in the past met with an adult that they'd only met online, younger people that drank just to get drunk, and those that had previously sent sexually suggestive material. That's not necessarily illegal content, that's posing an erotic type nature content. So I end with this. This is kind of, bringing in our understanding of victims, the importance of education, the importance of parents, what we talked about earlier in terms of technology industry, police, social work. We need to perhaps focus more on this idea of a collaborative, multidisciplinary approach. All right? It's everybody's problem, and everybody needs to play their part in it in a way that works, in a way that's communicated, and in a way that assists. And it's not just about how the police catch the perpetrators. It's about making sure teachers are giving appropriate awareness information and education. It's making sure they're having the difficult conversations about sexting, about image sharing, about strangers online. And it's also the responsibility of parents. I cannot tell you how many times I have sat in a police interviewing room with a 13 or 14-year-old victim whose mother is sitting there, who is crying and upset about how could this happen, why did she send this material, and eventually the young girl looks at her and screams, "You get angry at me, but I saw you doing it with your boyfriend on the phone too." So again, it's this idea of making sure people are aware of the messaging and making sure they're having the conversations. It's also making sure that we provide the appropriate assessment and intervention for perpetrators, for offenders. We've all had discussions about anonymous browsing before and the difficulties with that. So it's very, very fundamental that when this happens, we catch them, but we put them in not just as punishment. We ensure that we engage in rehabilitation and restoration as is possible. But these organizations need to work together. So I'm going to kind of just skip over those two and give my final remarks. Obviously, the internet's not going anywhere, and cyberspace and technology is not going anywhere. I mean, a recent research report in the UK stated that the average UK citizen above the age of 18 looks at their mobile phone 217 times a day. Again, it's not just looking at it for your texts, it's also for banking, socializing, entertainment. So we need to remember that the internet's good, technology's good to an extent, but that it's not going anywhere. Young people spend more and more time on cyberspace, unmonitored and unregulated, right? We want them to. That's how they talk to their friends. That's how they build their identities. But just because your little son or your little daughter is up in their room in your house doesn't mean they can't get into trouble. Teachers and parents need to be brought up to scratch. They need to do more, and they need to be more aware and have these difficult discussions. And again, I said, our victim typologies argue that this kind of balance between the real and online world is important, and that we need to understand risks and protection in both to provide support for these young people. So I thank you with that for your patience, and hopefully I was clear and didn't cause too much drama with the translation. And any questions you have later, please do come and see me.
Thank you.